And my name is Cynthia Gordigiwa, ProPublica's marketing director, and welcome to Is This Normal? Reviewing the 2020 election. As the country continues waiting for every vote to be counted, we've gathered an esteemed panel of experts in election administration and election law to help us better understand how the voting process went, and to provide more context and facts about how the counting of those votes is going now. A quick note, today's discussion is being recorded, and later today we'll be posting it to ProPublica's YouTube channel at youtube.com/ProPublica. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our panel today. Jessica Huseman is the lead reporter for ProPublica's Electionland project. Electionland is a national coalition of hundreds of newsrooms that monitor and report on ballot access issues in real time. And to help us do this, Electionland works with a team of experts who lend their data and experience to this work. With us today, we also have Marcia Johnson-Blanco, who is the co-director of the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Among other activities, Marcia leads Election Protection, the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection program. Trey Grayson is an attorney at the firm Frost Brown Todd. Trey previously served as a two-term Secretary of State for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, as well as president of the National Association of Secretaries of State and chair of the Republican Secretaries of State Association. Tammy Patrick is a senior advisor to the elections program at Democracy Fund. Focusing on modern elections, Tammy joined Democracy Fund in 2017 to help efforts for a voter-centric election system, and she works to provide election officials nationwide with the tools and knowledge they need to best serve their voters. And finally, we have Rachel Glickhouse, a journalist and the partner manager for ProPublica's Electionland, and she's our moderator for today's conversation. Again, if you'd like to submit a question at any time, click the Q&A icon to type it in, and we'll get to those during the Q&A portion. But first, I'll throw it over to ProPublica's Rachel Glickhouse. Rachel?
Thank you all so much for coming today. It's a Friday afternoon, so we're really excited to have so many people come and listen this afternoon and hear from us all. So my first question, which I'd like to put to all the panelists, is to talk about how voting went this year. So we saw historic levels of early and mail voting prior to Election Day, and we saw, a relatively smooth Election Day. So how did voting go this year in comparison to previous years or 2016? I'd like to start with Marcia, since you really had a bird's eye view of what was happening. Want to get us started?
Yes, sorry, my sound went out for a bit there, the hazards of doing this all virtually. In terms of, how the election went from the election protection perspective, I should say that this is my 5th presidential election doing election protection. And each time the program is different. And this year, what we saw beginning in March really is, the shift of election administration to being more vote by mail oriented in response to the pandemic. And that meant that a lot of voters had to learn about the vote by mail process, and a lot of election officials had to get prepared for many more voters voting by mail than ever before. And so I think what we saw, you mentioned that Election Day went a lot smoother because there were lots of lessons learned during the primary by both election officials getting ready for vote by mail and voters who learned about getting their votes in as early as possible and how that process works. And then also really taking advantage of the early voting process. What we saw with election protection is that we had more calls in October of this year than we did on Election Day in 2016. Just because there were so many more voters being engaged in the voting process. And so what I think this election showed is really a shift in how we vote, and people just learning about all the other ways you can vote, more so than just showing up at the polls. And I think what we're in right now is we're seeing the effect of the vote by mail is that you're not going to know on election day. And so we are now going through that process of counting all the votes. And unfortunately, that process is being exploited a bit, which I know we're going to get into a bit more. But it's just, for me, election 2020 just showed a big shift in how people are voting and how they understand and what they understand about the voting process and the opportunities to vote.
Jessica, could I put this question to you next?
You're muted.
So I think that I agree with everything that Marcia said. I think that, this bell cannot be unrung as it comes to vote by mail. And so I think that we're looking at kind of a new normal, although that new normal will be a little bit polished and perfected as the years go by. So it won't be as chaotic as this year. But I think that I'm impressed with how patient the American public has been, right? The protests and the big deal that the Trump campaign is making, the delay does not seem to, at this point, have filtered into the American public, and that's giving me a lot of hope. But I think that the day went shockingly well overall. I've been covering, this is my third election to cover as somebody who focuses only on election administration and not the returns and not all the other stuff. And I'm going to be honest, I think this election was better administered than 2016. There's going to be very little foundational evidence for Trump to claim that things went wrong because it just went so well. And I think that the expansion of early voting helped that a lot. There were just fewer people to cause problems on election day because so many people had already voted. And election administrators were basically prepared for every eventuality. So I have nothing bad to say about yesterday, really.
Trey, how about you?
Yeah, I thought it went well. There were months of preparation, months of innovations, months of new partnerships with nonprofits and businesses and professional athletes and celebrities. A lot of creativity to try to, how do you figure out how to pivot and run an election on pandemic? I do think, though, that I want to put this maybe in a larger arc, that I just think in general our elections have gotten better, maybe not in a straight line better, but better since 2000. A lot of the media and the public didn't pay much attention to or how our elections were run prior to 2000. So after 2000, we've had federal legislation and with the Help America Vote Act and financial assistance. We have more philanthropy dollars being focused on election administration, both on the watchdog side, like kind of what Jessica and ProPublica does, but then also on the, let's help election administrators get better, like what Tammy's been doing. We had a presidential commission that Tammy and I were on after the 2012 election. So there has been this general arc of professionalization, best practices, more innovation, helping to adapt to the way people vote. And that's why, as a country, I can't imagine if we were trying to pivot in a pandemic if this had been in 2000 or 2004. Just we're in a much better place to do that. Now, I want to add on a couple of things. On the vote by mail, one of the problems, I think, I don't know that the cat's out of the bag or whatever cliche I want to use for the vote by mail, because I think one of the problems with vote by mail out of this election is that it's become partisan or viewed through a partisan lens because of President Trump's comments. I do think, though, that for early voting in person, that may be a place where we can continue to push that expansion, because it did seem like Republicans embraced early in-person voting. The question would be, would they embrace that, in a normal non-pandemic time period? But in general, I'm just really proud of all the folks in the election world. And, I agree on the litigation. It doesn't seem like there's going to be a whole lot, or obviously we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it's just, it went well. And if the margins in some of the states were larger, we wouldn't even be focused on some of these little potential hiccups or things that maybe aren't true or just taken out of context. It just wouldn't matter because the large margins have an opportunity, help to shield some of things. It's never perfect. I always used to say, we didn't have long lines except in this one place. And so for you, election day was bad. If you're the voter who got stuck in that one precinct that didn't open on time, that was a bad experience for you. But when you look up at the 30,000 foot level, it was really successful. And I'm proud of everybody who helped to do that, including the voters.
How about you, Tammy?
Yeah, ditto. +1. I think that's really everybody has summed it up very, very well. I think one of the other lessons learned here is that many state and election officials were asking for months, if not for the last couple of years, to have some remedy, some statutory remedies, so that they could process vote-by-mail ballots before Election Day. And it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in the next legislative session. So for those viewers that haven't maybe been in the weeds as much as the rest of us on what exactly am I talking about, the states that we're waiting on are states that, for the most part, couldn't start processing until Monday or Tuesday on Election Day, and they had millions of ballots to literally open up the envelope. So if you think of yourself standing at your kitchen table or kitchen counter opening up your mail, now multiply opening up those envelopes by millions of envelopes. Just that one step of the process takes a really long time. And that's what election officials knew. That's what they said we needed to process early. And that's what was so important in this moment. I couldn't agree with Marcia more. In this moment, we weren't sure if voters were going to get their ballots back in time, if they were going to, act early. There was early action in the general that we didn't necessarily see in the primary. So I think everyone really learned a lot of lessons around how can we make sure that in this situation, we don't leave things up to chance, and that there isn't, another barrier thrown in our way of participation with the increase of COVID, with a weather event. So we had a hurricane that affected some of the country, and that could have been a much larger event. So I think in general, and Trey's absolutely right, no election is perfect. So we did have some hiccups around the country, but they were the standard challenges that we see pretty much every election. And I couldn't be more proud of both the election administrators, but my goodness, the American voter is tenacious. And if you start to put obstacles in front of their way, they're going to knock them down. They're knock them down hard. And so we not only saw huge increases in voter registration in the middle of a global pandemic, when we didn't have people with clipboards, at the county fair or in front of the library or the grocery store. Instead, we had, this massive voter registration turnout, or voter registration, which did equal and translate into turnout, which sometimes it doesn't. But in this moment, I just couldn't be more proud of our citizenry.
I have a quick follow-up on this for anyone who wants to answer. Something that we had been tracking earlier in the year, particularly around the time of some of the primaries, was that there was a big poll worker shortage because people were dropping out because they were afraid of getting sick. Many, many poll workers are elderly and therefore in a high-risk category for COVID. But something seemed to change after that, especially as that story got more media coverage. What actually ended up happening in the general with poll workers? Anybody?
I'm happy to jump in there real quickly, because that was one of my biggest concerns for Tuesday, is hearing about this third peak, that we would have massive numbers of poll workers that were either not going to show up, or that we would also have the challenge of first-time poll workers doing the job for the first time. And being a poll worker can be kind of complicated. And so I was really concerned that that was also going to be problematic. But what we saw through all sorts of efforts like Power the Polls and Work Elections and other individuals just out there soliciting people to, in this moment, I think people wanted to be engaged, and everyone wants to vote, but this was a point in our history where people were thinking, what else can I do to help this election cycle? And so there literally were hundreds of thousands of people that signed up to be poll workers. Many jurisdictions that in the past have been starved for filling their normal quota had 100 people sitting in their warehouse ready to dispatch for anybody that didn't show up because they were ill or for whatever reason. So that made a huge difference on Election Day. When you have enough people there to run the polling place, things definitely go a lot smoother.
I just want to touch briefly on one issue that I know people were very anxious about throughout the voting period, which was any attempts at intimidating voters trying to go into polling places or to drop off their ballots. Anyone who wants to, can you talk a little bit about what ended up happening in practice rather than what people's sort of anxieties were?
Yeah, I think this was the biggest sort of odd thing of the day. I mean, odd in the sense that everyone predicted that there would be mass chaos and mass, violence and intimidation, and we really didn't see much of it at all. I mean, every time I tuned into a, voter protection conference call throughout the day, and there were 3 or 4 organizations doing that, the first thing that they led with was always, this election is safe, this election is secure, we're not seeing mass violence. I just think that that was really stunning. And I think that, towards the end of the day, we saw an interesting thing happen, which is election administrators were really in an odd catch-22, which is that, because there was so much prediction of violence at the polls, they staffed up the polling locations with law enforcement officers. And then because there was no violence, towards the end of the day, especially, we started to see tips in the election protection hotline about officer presence at the polls. And so, I don't think that the election administrators did anything wrong necessarily. They were responding to events as they thought most appropriate. I don't think that there were a lot of election administrators intentionally placing cops out there to intimidate voters, but it was sort of an interesting situation for the day, which was no one's intimidating you, but maybe there were too many cops there, which is not at all what we thought the situation would be.
And can you briefly talk about poll watchers as well before we go to Marcia, because I'd love her to speak on this as well.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
About poll watchers, because you actually did a story on this.
Yeah, I did. Poll watchers, I think that people use the term poll watcher to be larger than it actually is. And so sometimes when we're looking through the complaints or the tips that we receive, it actually takes us a little while to figure out that the person that they're describing the bad behavior of is not a poll watcher, but some random dude walking up and down the line, which is not what poll watchers do. Poll watchers are very standardized, very regulated across the country. In every state, you have to register, and the party has to nominate you, and you have to present trained with paperwork. And we generally see very small, isolated instances of bad behavior with poll watchers, but they're not a big intimidating thing. They've been part of the election since the 1800s, and a lot of times they play, especially when there are things that go wrong at the polling location, they can play a really interesting and helpful role. But this year, the Trump campaign claimed to have recruited 50,000. I would be shocked if it was even a third of that. What I saw calling states and states and states is that by and large, Democrats had a larger poll watcher presence than Republicans. There were no major issues with poll watchers. I actually watched 20 different training videos for Trump poll watching folks. And they were all very standard and boring. And I think really, the reason that we don't see mass poll watching efforts is because the job is really boring. You just mostly sit there all day and watch people do really repetitive activities. So, it's not something that people are going to go and immediately sniff out fraud, which I think is what people assume, but that's not really how it plays out.
Marcia, could you talk about this intimidation issue? I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yes, so I think, one of the things that we were particularly concerned about is this narrative about intimidation and people showing up at the polls, militias and potential violence at the polls, because what I found is that rhetoric alone can have a chilling effect. People
I think you may have cut out for a second.
Yeah, that happened for me too.
Yeah.
Can you hear me all right or no?
We can hear you
okay,
now.
Good. Great. Yes, I was saying that the rhetoric that there will likely be violence at the polls tends to have a chilling effect. So we were really focused on making sure that people show up and that they know that there would be, elections, the polling place would be safe for people to vote. And if they weren't safe, that there were steps and plans in place, conversations we had with election officials about how to address that. And what we see a lot of the times with calls to the hotline is that excessive electioneering can be seen as being voter intimidation. And, we're in a very fraught environment right now, and people feel, very strongly about their candidates. And we did get, complaints about that. And that has been increasing over time because and they were, people who were in voters' spaces or voters felt they had to go through a phalanx of people supporting one candidate or another and felt very uncomfortable. And so, looking at the role that electioneering plays in this understanding about voter intimidation is really important. And then with regards to the police, we had a lot of conversations with election officials about what a police presence at the polls could mean for Black and Brown communities, and just being sure that I
think you just cut out again, if you want to back up to what that means for Black and Brown communities.
Anyway, so it was very important for us to have a lot of conversations in our voter education that we did about encouraging people to go out and vote and making sure that they weren't deterred by anticipated intimidation at the polls.
Can I jump in here for a second? Because when I was Secretary, electioneering was a big deal during my tenure, because our Kentucky's electioneering law was struck down like my first month in office as being too excessive by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. We had a 500-foot zone in Kentucky because we used to have election day was like a big party. And so people would gather around and you'd have to walk through that gauntlet like Marcia was describing to get to the polls. And it's always, a lot of this in elections is balancing, we want people to be able to campaign and exercise their First Amendment rights, but we also want to have people have the ability to not be intimidated. And where is that proper line and balance? And the same with law enforcement. As Marcia said, whether this is Black and Brown people or somebody in a small town and the mayor of the town has the town, the chief of police, go put in security by the polls. I mean, all of this is a fine line. And this was the challenge of this election, because it was the first time, and we really thought we might need it for true security purposes. But there is this chilling effect whenever you put law enforcement out. And I was struck by just a lot of the procedures we've adapted over the years seem to work pretty well. Poll watchers by requiring registration and training in advance, made that as an option to help oversee how the election day went, in a precinct, but prevented people from just showing up. And the same with the electioneering laws, they kind of provide that little bubble. And then finally, the bipartisan nature of most of our vote counting, either bipartisan count, you have Republicans, Democrats doing the count together, or they're the observers. And so all those features are built into our system to try to increase the trust that voters will have in the process. And we're seeing why, this was a high stress election, and we're seeing why those procedures have been in place for a while. And we're seeing the results of that. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody had trust in this election, but imagine if we'd had an election without this election and this environment without those safeguards, how much worse it would have been.
Anything, Tammy, from you on that?
No, I think that's all spot on. I mean, there was some real consideration. I think part of this is that you also have the contextualization of where the things are happening, right? So right now we're seeing individuals out in front of Maricopa County with semi-automatic weapons. And in the time that I was there, they would show up at the polling place as well. So in an open carry state, it took me a long time to get accustomed to seeing somebody walking around town with a holster, or being in a bank and seeing somebody with a holster on their hip. So for me, it was that context of, it's in states where they do have open carry, it is a little bit different for some people, but the other context is this moment. In this country, in 2020, all of those things are viewed in a very different way. Because of what we've experienced in the last 6 or 7 months. And as Marcia said, it's a question of whether or not that electioneering is still just electioneering, or is it in fact an intimidation factor. And that's where I think it was really important that in this moment, with voters, standing in line with the 6 foot distancing, there were more people outside probably than ever before. And I was really concerned that all of that was going to escalate, because it's easy to escalate things in this moment, whether it was somebody who didn't want to put a mask on that made somebody else feel uncomfortable, or somebody who was over enthusiastic as a supporter of a particular candidate or issue. And then those who were truly there to intimidate and to do it purposefully. So there was one instance where, you know, there were individuals on two different street corners, some with semi-automatic weapons and others, you know, not. And when you bring a weapon like that, a weapon of war, out in public, you're doing so for a very purposeful reason. And I think that that's something that we're going to need to grapple with as a country in the ensuing months, if not years.
So I'd like to pivot a bit and talk about something we were discussing beforehand, which is lawsuits. First of all, there have been many lawsuits this year related to voting. I had been trying fruitlessly to track them every week, but it was nearly impossible. There were a couple trackers that did that, so that was very helpful. But there were hundreds and hundreds of them that changed the rules back and forth, particularly relating to mail voting. So we had we've gotten through a slew of those during the entire year. And now that we've gotten to the counting process, we have a new bunch of lawsuits that are happening related to the counting process and a couple of other things, many being driven by the Trump campaign right now. So I'd like to start with the lawyers to talk about first of all, if you want to talk about the lawsuits over the course of the year, I think that might be interesting, but tell us what you think is going to happen with these counting lawsuits.
Well, I'll start with the lawsuits that happened before Election Day, because my organization, the Lawyers Committee, was involved, I think, in about 30 lawsuits before Election Day. And the goal of those lawsuits was to ensure that our vote by mail processes worked for all voters in a pandemic. So, you know, there are states that had affidavit requirements or needing needing ballots to be notarized, or making sure that the deadlines actually worked with the reality of where a postal service, the mailing happens, or whether you needed ID. So, you know, a lot of those lawsuits was just to make sure that voters who wanted to take advantage of vote by mail could take advantage of vote by mail, and some of these requirements to vote by mail wouldn't get in the way of voters being able to do so. And we also had lawsuits about drop boxes, because there were states like Ohio and Texas that only had one drop box per county. Of course, the population in counties vary tremendously. And so that wasn't an equal opportunity for people to drop off their ballots. So I think also, you know, in terms of, you know, I talked before about that preparation before Election Day and that learning before Election Day. The lawsuits played a role in, you know, paving the way for voters to be able to cast ballots that will count, and particularly that the ballots would, you know, that ballots that were received on Election Day or postmarked on Election Day would indeed be counted, because it was very much anticipated that after Election Day there would be the lawsuits that we're seeing, because we're used to, as a country, getting the results on Election Day. And the reality was, well, because of the tremendous use of vote by mail, that wasn't going to happen. And so we wanted to make sure that it was very clear what the process was, and the courts had spoken in situations where there would be a question about which ballots should be counted. And you know, right now that's what's being addressed by, you know, the Trump campaign. And our position, you know, at the Lawyers Committee is that if you followed the rules of your state and got your ballots in under those rules, then those ballots should be counted. And the fact that we still need to do it, so we have to wait some days after Election Day has passed to get the results, shouldn't matter, as long as you're making sure that voters, you know, follow the process and the ballots are being counted. One more thing I'll say is that one of the things that has been really interesting in the pre-Election Day litigation is the Purcell doctrine that the Supreme Court has instituted, which essentially says that if you trying to change the rules of election close to Election Day, that they would resist, you know, they wouldn't allow jurisdictions to do that. And we found in many cases that doctrine being used to keep in place processes that made it harder for voters to be able to vote. And it's something that, you know, we ran up against in bringing election litigation before Election Day, because sometimes the change does happen close to Election Day that isn't beneficial to voters, but then you have this doctrine that says, well, you don't have enough time to try to address and change that. But I would say overall, a lot of the litigation that was done before Election Day, both with regards to vote by mail and the Postal Service litigation that we saw as well, just helped to really clarify what the rules were for voters, and I think helped to inform this process that we're going through right now as well.
Trey, can you talk a little bit about the Trump litigation?
Yeah, so the Trump litigation you're seeing, well, in advance of Election Day, there was kind of, I'll call it the probably the legal principle that they were pushing, and then the kind of the real motivation. But the legal principle would be a little bit what Marcia says, is changing the rules, too close to an Election Day. And then there's also the Supreme Court. U.S. Supreme Court seems to have an interpretation that it goes to if the state courts do something, they will let that stand. But if it's a federal judge, a lower court judge whose ruling in effect changes a law, that's when they stop that. Now that what we're seeing with the Trump campaign, now that we're in this sort of post-election phase, we're in the counting phase, and we're going to be in the recounting phase, in the contest phase. In some states, I don't think any of the battleground states, but like in Kentucky, in order to do a recount or a contest, that's actually a judicial proceeding. So you file a suit to start that process. I don't think that's how it works in these other states. I think it's more of an administrative proceeding, but those rules are going to be, we're going to be end up in court like we did in Florida as we kind of work through that. A lot of right now, though, it's focusing on the oversight of the, making sure that, the people can watch the counting process or part of the counting process. And so like the classic one, I urge people, if you're really interested, is there was this great case in the last couple of days there where the judge is like, Trump campaign, Biden campaign, go figure it out and come back and tell me, how many people do you want to have in the room? How far away? And just come back to me. And then the judge signed an order on the agreement. And it was like, and at the end of it, it was fine. Like, you're right. You can have your people, just don't let them get in the way. So the other strategy here on the front end, I think with the Trump campaign, there was a belief that higher turnout was bad for Republicans. My hope is, I'm a Republican who never believed that, but my hope is this election with record-setting turnout, that arguably Republicans had a good day, except for the presidential race, picking up U.S. House seats, legislative chambers, keeping other statewides, and maybe having control of the U.S. Senate. That shows me that big turnout shouldn't be, the Republicans shouldn't fear it, and we ought to try to just win and not try to put in these barriers to voters. But there was a belief, I think, by the Trump campaign and by the Republicans, so they wanted to fight some of the lawsuits, even if there were substantive reasons, like the law doesn't allow it or it's too close to an election. That was the motivator. And now I think another motivator, in addition to fairness, look, lawsuits happen, things happen on election day, and we should expect, regardless, if Biden lost or we're losing right now, we would expect the Biden campaign to be suing in various cases. But I think some of what's going on, because some of these Trump cases are so frivolous, is they just want to have a smell. They want this to kind of muck it up and say, not so much muck up that particular process, but like all these lawsuits are all designed to kind of make it look like a process that shouldn't be trusted. We were talking off air that I was just in a text exchange with a couple of my closest childhood friends who are big Trump supporters who don't trust what's going on right now. And I'm trying to explain to them, and I'm arguing with two of them simultaneously. And so the lawsuits are part of that process to convince Republicans, to convince Trump supporters that this isn't a good process. I don't know what the final end game with that is, because that's not going to win in a court of law. And it's bad for our democracy, but that's one of the things that's going on. And so maybe it's just simply to allow Trump to say, I didn't really lose this, I got it stolen, and he can feel better about the loss. Or maybe it's to raise money, or maybe it's to keep people in profile or to win other elections. But a lot of these are just kind of frivolous right now because the evidence isn't really there. But as we pivot more to the recount phase, I think we should have some more substantive lawsuits if there's evidence, usually when they start to appear. But right now it's just a lot of show, bad show, unfortunately.
My colleague Ian McDougall, I believe it was Ian, did a story where he quoted Justin Levitt as saying that some of these frivolous lawsuits are like a tweet with a filing fee, which I thought was very funny.
We had a frivolous suit when I was Secretary of State, and I actually sought sanctions from this guy, and we got it. Like, Marcia, you'll appreciate this. We got sanctions at the trial judge, and then he appealed, and then the appeal court was like, this is crazy, and we sanctioned him again. And then, I wish in some of these cases more people sought some sanctions to deter some of this bad behavior. Because in elections context, you get a lot of it because you have political motivations that aren't just aligned with, who's right on the law.
So we're going to go to the Q&A in about a minute. But I think one of the things we want to talk about, and I know that we got a bunch of questions about, is the process that we are entering now, which is the counting process, about how absentee ballots are getting counted, how provisional ballots are going to be counted, how rejections work when it comes to absentee ballots, because a lot of people are voting by mail for the first time and are very unfamiliar with this process. So very quickly, before we get into those questions, does someone want to talk very briefly about how this process works in terms of when they are actually counting? What are they actually doing in the room when they're counting the ballots, particularly the absentee ballots?
This seems like a Tammy answer.
So I think it's important to note a couple of things here. One is that counting of ballots has been happening for weeks before the elections office in some states, and for weeks after Election Day in almost every state, in almost every elections office. So that is nothing new. Right now, even though we're only paying attention to a few states, there are ballots being counted all over the country. I think there's 4.5 million ballots still outstanding in California that will be counted in the next couple of weeks, but we're not talking about that. So the process is the same across all of these states. So even if a state can start it before Election Day or after, once the ballots come in and the voters authenticated, and that can mean a variety of things. It can mean that they have a notary in a couple of places. It can mean that the signature was there was a signature, or that the signature was verified and compared to something else, whether it was taking that ballot envelope and comparing it to the application for the ballot itself, or having an online system that uses banking software to verify the signature. So once it's authenticated, then it goes to a board that extracts the ballot from the envelope, what I was mentioning earlier. In some cases, it's a Democrat and a Republican, or two people of different parties that sit aside across from one another, and they are taking out the ballots, separating it from the envelope, so you no longer know whose ballot it is, so it's now anonymous. And that's an important aspect when we talk about this lawsuits, because once it's separated, you can't go back and tie those two things together and challenge that ballot, because you no longer know who the voter is. In this moment, though, many states did get some funding to be able to get some extraction equipment. So in some states, they have a machine that makes a slit, puffs some air in, opens up the envelope, and you simply just pull out the ballots. So once the ballots are extracted and unfolded, then they go to scanning machines, which scan the ballots and know who it is that you made the selections for. Not that it's your ballot, but who you selected. And it's only at the end of running those ballots through that they tally them. So all of the places that pre-process before Election Day, they release those results on Election Day at the close of the polls, along with early in-person voting, as well as the ballots that are cast on Election Day. That's why in states like Arizona, many of their vote-by-mail ballots were already part of the release on the 3rd, but anything that was dropped off at the polls or at Dropbox on Monday or Tuesday or came in through the mail, those are the things that are still being processed now. And that's why when we're watching the processing, we're not getting hourly updates. It's kind of like when you change out your register, if you've ever done retail, or you've been in line at a retail shop when the cashiers have changed out. At the end of every shift, they'll do their tallies, they'll run their reports, and start the next shift. So that's why we're getting reports at different times in different states and in different times in different counties. I mean, it's really important that we remember that it's not that we ever have results on Election Day. We have some unofficial results, but what's happened in this moment, and I always quote Ned Foley on this because I think he said it and I was like, that makes perfect sense now. On Election Day in the past, and this year as well, the media project who the winner will be when all the ballots are counted. In this moment, the media has not been comfortable projecting who the winner is going to be in some places. And so we're waiting until we're able to count enough of the ballots to project who the winner will be in those cases. But in some of these states, we'll still be counting for weeks.
That is really helpful, Tammy. Thank you. Cynthia, do you want to move on to audience questions?
Yes. So our first question comes from Victor. What is your sense of the U.S. Postal Service's effect on voting? There was so much hand-wringing about the slowing of the mail, but did that have a meaningful impact?
I think that the hand-wringing had more of an impact than the actual mail delays. And I'll let Tammy talk about that more, but I do think that, you know, this specific aspect of 2020 has been one of the more frustrating things to me, just because people just genuinely don't understand how the mail works. I have never been as alarmed as other people in terms of the way that USPS was going to process this. And I think that the final court challenge that brought a lot of drama to Tuesday with USPS like defying a judicial order made everything seem more pressing. But I'm still convinced that, you know, we're talking about a couple thousand votes across the entire country, rather than, you know, hundreds of thousands of election swinging votes.
So I've served as kind of a liaison between the election official world and representing the, you know, the interests of the voters with the Postal Service for almost a decade. And it's been important to know that up until this Postmaster General, we have put into place many, many protocols like sweeping of the plants on a routine basis over the course of the day, looking for election mail, having all clear reports at the end of the night to make sure that all of the ballots have been processed that came in to that processing plant on the day. And it was only until we saw this new Postmaster General that I started to get concerned that some of the protocols and active processes and procedures that we've implemented in the past, the prioritization of ballots, were going to be undermined or not done at all. That was my concern this summer, and I voiced it in, you know, congressional testimony as well as any other platform that I was given. However, it was after the postmaster was kind of brought before Congress and reiterated that those policies would be maintained that we did in fact see the sweeping of the plants, the all clear reports. But I don't just take the Postal Service's word for it. So I don't want to sound like, you know, like I have had too much of the Kool-Aid. I also checked with state and local election officials to see what kind of timeframes they were seeing with their ballots. They were not reporting delays. I checked with some of the ballot tracking companies. They were showing 96-97% of the ballots that they tracked were between 1 and 5 days, and the average being a 2-day delivery time period. One of the challenges we have here is when we think about late ballots or late delays, is that the Postal Service standard is 2 to 5 days for delivery, and they recommend you put your ballot in the mail a week before election day or the due date, because in some states it is due on Monday. But I don't think a lot of people really understand that, because we have 20-some states that allow you to request a ballot after that time period. 7 states allow you to request a ballot on Monday for Tuesday's election, and that's setting up voters to fail. If you set that wrong expectation, I think that's really problematic. So I'm hopeful that we can get states to change those request deadlines so they actually do align with postal delivery standards and allow voters to have some additional options in return. So this year we saw more states doing ballot tracking. We saw more states prepaying for the postage on return. We saw more states offering for the postmark to be a part of it, part of the ability. And that's not to say the states, all the states that wanted to do that were allowed to. Too many times we had the partisan nature of the politics of it stepping in the way of being able to actually conduct an election in a global pandemic. The fact that we were, you know, weaponizing voting by mail in a global pandemic is terrible. And we did know that early in the summer or early in the spring, you know, large numbers, 75% of the electorate was saying they'd probably vote by mail in the fall. And then as this rhetoric came around between the president, you know, calling into question the integrity of the process, then the undermining of the Postal Service, and, you know, seeing these things about sorters pulling offline and mailboxes being taken down, which all of those things, they should have been more transparent. Absolutely. The Postal Service needs to do a much better job of explaining themselves. And I'll just say one last thing, and that is in regards to the defiance of the court order, it's important to know that sweeps were being done in the plants and the all clears at the end of the night. It's just that they didn't align with exactly when the court ordered the timing of it to happen. And that can be because depending on where the plant is, you can have trucks coming from great distances. And so as the mail flows through the processing plant, you want to do your sweeps when you have the most mail. So doing it at 3:30 in the afternoon or 4:30 in the afternoon may not be the best time because you maybe don't even have your greatest volume yet. You want to do that as the volumes should be moving out. So that's, very weedy. But I was pleased with some of the things that the Postal Service did this time, and I have a long list of things we're going to work on next year.
Okay, next question.
Can I just add really quickly about, again, going back to the litigation that happened before Election Day, because during the voter education, during the primaries, we did see this misalignment that Tammy talked about with voters requesting ballots and not getting them in time or not getting them back to election officials in time. So there was a lot of education done before Election Day, and it was telling people, if make sure that you get your ballots in the mail by this certain time. If it's after this time, drop it off yourself, take it to a drop box. So that also contributed, I think, to lessening the threat about the Postal Service not being able to deliver ballots on time.
Thank you. So do you feel that our current state-by-state system of voting rolls has enough benefits that it should be retained? Or would there be benefits to having voting rules that are set at the federal level and identical in every state? Big picture question.
Oh man, this is such a good question. I think that there are benefits to how diffuse America's election system is. It is, for example, very difficult to manipulate ballots at any real scale because of it. I do think, though, and while I don't know that we need to eliminate all of the decentralization of America's election system, because I think that rural voters just have very different needs than urban voters. There are pockets of American citizens that need specific ballot access that others don't. It makes sense for me to have some delineation, but I do think in terms of information sharing and deadlines and the high level problems that we have, right? Like the states don't have the same deadlines, states don't have the same vote by mail requirements, states don't have, it's very difficult for the media or for the federal government to help local governments do education campaigns. And we know that local governments really struggle with the budget necessary to do that. So if some of the higher level things could be standardized, then I think we would be able to educate the population a little bit more succinctly than we are right now. But I do think that there are benefits security-wise from being as sort of separated as we are.
Yeah, and I would add, there's definitely a role for federal legislation to play in setting a floor, whether it comes to, voter registration opportunities, like the National Voter Registration Act, and including, online voter registration across the board, or early voting across the board. There's some, or even the funding of, machines, or making sure that there's that standardization there. There's certainly things that federal legislation has a role to play in.
I think the one thing I would add is I tend to be more of an advocate for the kind of, in general, I think the federal system works for pretty well. And I'm with Marcia that I think having the floors is good. One thing that I would like to see that is standardized, I'd like to see the federal government provide a little bit of money on a regular basis that we could just count on at the state and local level to boost state budgets to focus on election security. We haven't talked much about that, which is a good thing. The election security in this conversation hasn't come up yet because we think it was a pretty clean election, and there's been a lot of work in the last 4 years to overcome some of the challenges that we faced 4 years ago, and we were caught off guard. But that would be a nice piece, and I think you could get some bipartisan agreement on that. The other challenge is, there's kind of philosophical disagreement on sort of the role of the federal government. My presumption had been if Biden had won and the Democrats controlled both chambers and this filibuster went away, that we would see some attempts legislatively to standardize things across the country. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I thought the Democrats would do that in 2009 and 10, and I think they were planning. They just didn't think they were going to lose the majority after 2 years. So that I don't believe they would have made that mistake again. So the next time the Dems have the opportunity to do that, it wouldn't shock me if you saw some more standardization of a federal election, or of all elections, excuse me.
Okay, our next question. Were there any noticeable demographic differences in the learning about and using the new voting by mail process, such as age, ethnicity, income, etc.?
I think some of that is yet to be determined. So, you know, until we have final results and we know who returned ballots through the mail, who dropped them off, who decided to go vote in person and didn't use the vote by mail ballot, until we have time to, you know, to really dig into some of that. I haven't seen any sort of academic study yet because, of course, some of those things are still being processed.
And I'll just put the caveat out, you know, on the one hand, it seems like the polls leading into the election weren't very good. And so whatever the post-election exit surveys show and all that now, I'm still going to be curious about that. Now, some of the methods of voting, we can probably determine that through state records. You know, states keep track of the way that people voted. They know how old voters are. They know, you know, often know gender and race, but not always. And academics sometimes have the ability to match that database, even if it has some of the missing elements to other databases. And so those could be trusted, but I wouldn't trust an exit poll saying X number of people voted by mail or in person on election day to probably provide, you know, I would hold off until the political scientists crunch the numbers, till Charles Stewart tells us.
And I would add a couple other resources there. It'd be Dr. Kay Kiwishawa Ginsburg at Circle at Tufts. If you're interested mostly or particularly in the youth vote, she has a fabulous program there. And then also Mindy Romero at UC Davis has a lot of really great demographic data, particularly in California with the implementation of the Voters' Choice Act.
Okay, so we have a number of questions in here about this, and I also got some email to me. So is this what's happening? This is what people are asking about. Why were Republicans not allowed to watch the votes get counted in one of the Democratic states, but in Republican counties and states, they let Democrats observe ballot counting? So I pose that to the panel.
That is not happening. The poll watching is a very regulated thing. There are very clear bright lines in every state for what's legal and what's not legal. If the Republican Party is allowed to do it, so are the Democrats, and vice versa. So if you hear that a Democrat poll watcher is being treated differently than a Republican poll watcher, or the reverse of that, then it is either a ridiculously isolated situation or it's not true. And I think most of the time it's the latter.
Can you comment on the record turnout that we've all been talking about? Do you think this level of participation will continue?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think that, you know, Marcia hinted this earlier in the panel, but, you know, I think that part of the huge turnout, especially in places like Texas, which is where I find myself right now, it was because of the brazen attempts at not counting all of the votes. I think that people really rebelled against that, and they were like, oh, you can't tell me what to do, and then showed up to the polls, right? In the same way that, like, people didn't want to wear masks, they also didn't want to be told that they couldn't vote. So I think that you know, the American sense of individualism here is worked in our favor in terms of the attempts to suppress the vote. I don't know if this will continue. I have a lot of hope, right, that, you know, political science shows that if you vote once, you're most likely to vote again. And so I think that all of the new people who are very hotly participating in this one, I think chances are they will continue to participate. And so I'm hoping that this is the new normal.
I did a couple of things. I mean, one, we did make it easier to vote because of a pandemic. So we made more options. People could vote early voting so that social distancing could be more effectively accomplished in person on election day or in person early, as well as more vote by mail options. So presumably some of that played a role. Although some studies of, you know, in presidential elections, I think the data used to not be as clear that necessarily increased turnout, but it definitely increased turnout in off-year elections. But I can't help but think that made a difference. Donald Trump makes a difference. Donald Trump inspires some people to come out and vote, and he also for him and against him. So that's an element that this is kind of a unique election. Also, I think the other thing, just from a campaign standpoint, all the folks voting earlier, and especially in most states that allow campaigns and parties to find out who has requested an absentee ballot or who's already voted, then allows you to allocate your resources to those who haven't. So the more people that vote early, then my volunteers and my money can be focused on the folks who are left, and I can flush them to the polls. And my guess is that probably made a difference too. Kentucky, I say not a battleground, but we had our largest number of votes by far cast in our state. And a lot of the political professionals attribute that, frankly, just to the more people voting early allowed us to, door knockers to go to fewer people, or maybe go to the 1 and 5s or the 0 and 5s as opposed to some of the 5 and 5s. So there's a whole lot of factors, and I think we're all on this panel hopeful that this trend it'll become a trend. It won't just become a one-off.
Yeah, and I would just add, just really quickly, in terms of the defiance, we did see during early voting, particularly on the first day of early voting, the hours-long lines of people showing up to vote and to wait in those lines until they were able to vote. So there was this pushback against what was seen as trying to keep people from voting and making sure that they took advantage of early voting. And the thing that was really great about early voting for us is that if someone had an issue or a problem, there was time for them to get it addressed before election day, and then they could still have that opportunity to vote. So I certainly hope that there's an across the board opportunity for people to be able to vote early, because I think that contributed greatly to the turnout as well.
I would say that exactly that. So if voters had a good voting experience, they might come back, and hopefully the opportunities that they were afforded because of the global pandemic, that those will be shored up in legislation in the next session so that they have those continued options.
So we have time for one more question. I'd like for Rachel to close out the panel to get some closing thoughts.
So ultimately, we have a lot of things happening, litigation, ongoing counting. What do you think this election will ultimately come down to? And that doesn't just include like ending up in the Supreme Court. It could also come down to certain demographic groups that came out to vote. What do you think ultimately the result of this election will boil down to? And I'd like to hear from everybody.
So I think that both parties have a bit of a reckoning to do with outreach to Hispanic voters. I think that is one of the more obvious polling errors that we have in this year, that we see Hispanics and Latinos and Chicanos as like a massive singular demographic when they are anything but. And so I think that both parties are going to need to do more directed outreach. I think that one of the reasons that Trump was so effective is because he did targeted outreach, especially in places like Florida with the Venezuelan and the Cuban community. The Democrats did not drill down as well. And also I think the media failed to sort of see that coming. And so I think we just need to pay a little bit more attention to the demographic groups that we serve. And I think that, hopefully that happens in the coming years. But, I also think that a lot of the things that are going to sort of decide this election have already been done. I mean, like the votes are going to decide this election. And I think that because this was such a well-administered election, a lot of the lawsuits and the rancor are going to fizzle out. I would be shocked if the Supreme Court had to weigh in here at all. But if they do, I don't imagine that it's going to like flip an election that very clearly went for Joe Biden to Donald Trump.
Yeah, so I live in the nonpartisan realm. So what I'm going to talk about is just echoing what Tammy was saying, that this election has shown how all the opportunities there are to be able to vote. And it is my hope that there will be legislation solidifying some of those opportunities, and it wouldn't just be a temporary fix to a pandemic, but that it opens larger opportunities for voters to be able to cast a ballot. And the narrative for this election was November 3rd was the last day to vote, not the only day to vote. and hopefully that becomes ingrained. And what I would like to see coming out of this period we are in right now is that every vote that was cast will be counted and will be taken into consideration for the outcome, and that lawsuits trying to stop the count prematurely will fail.
And I would just add that I think what we've seen is that a system that is voter-centric serves the voters well, and results in outcomes up and down the ticket, up and down the ballot, that are more reflective of our very, very diverse electorate.
Oh, so I get the last word. No, no, I agree with so much of what was just said earlier. My hope is that maybe one thing I'll add that's different is, I mentioned this earlier, the innovations and the partnerships. So many new groups, and LeBron James stepping up in professional sports teams, and craft beer distributors, and insurance companies. All these different people stepping up to help solve problems with poll worker recruitment and getting messaging out about the changing rules and deadlines and things like that. My hope is that that becomes a permanent part of our elections, that it will help us, it will just result in a better election system. And that could go a long way to explaining some of the smoothness, because we had lots of people, and also put the media in here. The media played a really helpful role in communicating how this election was going to work, even down to like explaining the red mirage and blue shift that we're going through right now, where it looks like the red mirage, blue shift are settling into a Biden win, but a pretty good night in other respects for Republicans. But more in the public are aware of that, as opposed to if the media hadn't played its role. So hopefully these partnerships will continue going forward.
Okay, well, that's our time for today. Thank you to our panelists so much for the informative talk. And to those in the audience, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.